So, Freddie, what's your question and who is it from?
So Phil asks, could Boris Johnson become Prime Minister again by being appointed to the Lords? Which is a very interesting question. And I think we chose less so about Boris Johnson and more so about the Lords and how they've, what role they play in our constitution now in terms of who can become Prime Minister and who can't. So I think, first of all, in terms of, it's worth noting that anyone really could, anyone technically can become Prime Minister. By convention nowadays, it's always someone from the House of Commons. I think the last Prime Minister we had from the Lords was the Marquis of Salisbury, I think, back in the 19th century. And then I think...
A classic term.
well, it was, yeah. And then we also had Alec Douglas Home, who was actually an Earl back in the start of the 60s. And when he became Prime Minister, he stepped down and spent 2 weeks being neither in the House of Commons or the House of Lords, which is just points to the fact that anyone can become Prime Minister. So that was an interesting situation. And then he stood in a by-election, rejoined the Commons, relinquished his earldom, as one does, and then became Prime Minister. So that sort of set the convention up for what we've seen so far. And then, so that's not going to happen. But the other thing is Boris Johnson ever going to be appointed to the Lords? That strikes me as unlikely, given that he would have to be appointed by one of his successors, with whom he's not particularly popular.
Good point. And if there is a House of Lords at all, remember Labour has said that they're going to abolish it.
Although they also seem prepared to appoint a lot of new Labour peers to make sure they get their legislation through. So let's see how that turns out.
Can hark back to his SDP days.
But I mean, if there was a route back, you could imagine an eccentric one such as that for Boris Johnson. You know, I think he would certainly like that idea to be put around. I expect, but. Yeah, I mean, just whether somebody would appoint him, doesn't seem likely that anybody would. It doesn't seem likely that Liz Truss would be prepared to make him a peer at the moment. I think probably even Boris Johnson at this point would recognise that now he's not at the height of his popularity at the moment, and would probably have to do some work on that before any kind of return.
It just shows, if we're asking these questions, the sort of sheer poverty of choice in the Conservative Party at the moment, because, you know, they've really rattled around the different factions, the different potential leaders in the various changes of leadership that they've had. And it just shows sort of a whiff of desperation there. That, you know, they're trying to turn to these people who actually, constitutionally, it wouldn't be very easy to have them in charge.
No, not at all. But it's interesting what you said about Labour as well. We've had a fresh story this week saying that Labour plan on filling the House of Lords with new peers, which often happens when new governments come in, because over time, with the previous administration, their number of Lords reduces as the government's appointing people from their own party, which sort of suggests that abolishing the House of Lords won't be at the top of their agenda when they first come in. It never is. As we I think we said at the time back in October or December when the Gordon Brown report came out, it's always so tricky to reform the House of Lords, and given the priorities that Labour has, you can't imagine they're going to get into a big fight with the Conservatives and other vested interests in society over constitutional reform in the first term.
It's too useful. There's no Tory majority in the Lords as well.
No.
Even now. It's always, that's a second term thing.
Yeah, quite. Yeah, and also there's the convention as well that as long as it's in your manifesto, it can go through the House of Lords. So as long as their manifesto is sufficiently detailed, which I'm not sure it will be at the moment, then they should be able to get everything through. But it's an interesting question.
But in this era, could a peer become, you know, leader of a party? I don't know. Like, I think, you know, given how the kind of rows we've had over the last few years between the Lords and the Commons,
it's a very different character in the Lords.
Yeah, I don't think the public would find it acceptable to have, you know, just an appointed leader of a main party.
Also, if you were party leader in the Lords, your sort of peers, in both senses of the word, in the House of Lords, are more likely to be independent-minded. They're more likely to be rebellious. They're more likely to putting awkward amendments down, and it might make you look quite weak if you're trying to lead the party from that power base, because it's not the same as, you know, how generally quite disciplined MPs can be.
It would be utterly bizarre, because, you know, one of Boris Johnson's sort of most significant political achievements was helping the Brexit campaign to win, and that was about direct democracy. And then to return as like an appointed peer would just be, it would be kind of perverse.
The definition of democracy is quite malleable.
Just like our constitution. And of course, lastly, Keir Starmer gets hammered a bit in focus groups for being a sir. there's a slight lack of understanding of where that Sir comes from. So maybe having a Lord as leader would also be a disadvantage in that pure kind of shallow sense of what it sounds like.
Yeah, I mean, anything but a directly elected woman, right? I mean,
Okay, that's a good depressing note to end on. Thanks, Rachel. Thanks to everyone who submitted questions. We do read them all, so please keep sending them in. If you'd like to send us a question, just go to newstatesman.com/youaskus. And if you're watching on YouTube, you can leave a comment under the video. Thanks so much for watching. We'd love to know what you think. Please make sure you leave your comments below. And if you enjoyed watching this podcast, you can watch more of our videos on our YouTube channel. And don't forget to like and subscribe.